What's up, Knife World? This is Ryan from Knife Pivot Lube here today to talk to you about handle materials. Now, this is one of my very favorite topics, but before we get started, what's in the pocket today? Well, I am carrying the Quiet Carry Drift. This knife, which was introduced in 2019, was voted in that year the best new EDC knife, and for good reason. This knife is a joy to carry. It features titanium handle scales, a frame lock with a lock bar insert made out of LC200N, a wire pocket clip that is very well done, I might add, extremely strong, and a blade made out of Vanax Super Clean. This is a very interesting alloy in which a lot of the hardening is done through the addition of nitrogen rather than carbon. That leads to an extremely stainless steel. And in terms of execution, the guys at Quiet Carry have just done a great job of making a knife that's extremely flickable. When I first got mine, I of course lubed it up with Knife Pivot Lube, just a drop on each side of the blade so that it could work its way into those phosphor bronze bushings. Gives you a knife that just wants to flick out with ease due to the lack of weight up front. We're going to use this guy later in the video today, but for now we'll put him away and move on to all of the materials that we have on offer to us as knife purchasers these days. Starting off with one of the materials that is often considered low end, but doesn't necessarily need to be. We're talking about all plastic knife handles or knife scales. I've got a Swiss Army Walker here. This one comes in their Celador handles. These are 100% plastic and nothing else. There is no reinforcing element. These are used typically for decorative purposes. You're not going to get a lot of strength out of a knife handle that is made out of plastic alone. If you try to use plastic alone as a strength member when you're building a knife, what you're going to run into is one of the properties of plastics that is very common, kind of across the board in all of the different varieties of plastic, and that is creep. That is, as plastics are stressed over time, whether it's because you have screws screwed into them, putting compressive pressure on the plastics, or whether they're actually offering strength to the knife as you're cutting with it, there's pressure being put on the plastic of that knife. What you're going to get over time is deformation of the plastic. It's no longer going to maintain its original proportions, which is going to lead to a knife that doesn't fit the way it used to. Now, plastic can be an excellent choice because it polishes up very nicely, and you can see Swiss Army, Victorinox, which I have a very high opinion of, uses plastic extensively on its decorative scales. And you'll see on this Victorinox that it has steel backers that plastic is affixed to so that it doesn't warp over time. We also see it occasionally in other slip joint knives where it's polished up for appearance. But if you're looking at a knife that's got a plain plastic handle and is not something like this, where it's just being used as a scale, you're probably looking at a lower end knife. We're talking the Z Hunters of the world, the bargain bin Walmart knives of the world. Probably something that you're going to want to avoid. To the contrary, there are knives with handles that look like they're made out of plastic, but are actually not. These are composite handles. Spyderco is kind of the master of this type of material. They use it in a lot of their line. This is fiber reinforced polymer. So in the Delica here, we have a glass fiber reinforced nylon. In the Manix, we have a fiber reinforced copolymer. And the reason we call these composites is because the handle scales are composed of two different materials that are mixed, but not to the extent that one is dissolved in the other. In these knives, what we have is very small glass fibers that are chopped up and then mixed into molten plastic. In this case, we're talking nylon. Before that plastic is injected into an injection mold and then cooled. What you get in composite materials is a combination of the best attributes of both materials. Glass fiber is extremely stiff and very strong and hard. Nylon is an extremely tough, flexible material. You see it a lot in climbing ropes. It's also very heat tolerant, being able to handle heats, in excess of 300 degrees, depending on the type of nylon. These knife scales end up being extremely tough and extremely rigid. They add a lot of stability to the knife, meaning that you're not going to be able to bend it very easily. They're also very good at handling abrasion from the externals. And that's because of the glass fibers that are added to these scales in very high concentrations. And if you look under the microscope, you can actually see those just barely protruding from the surface. Right up against the surface, we've got flush pieces of glass, not poking out, but showing themselves. And so when things like rocks or pieces of metal bump up against the knife scale, they're going to be running into something that's as hard as glass. It ends up making for a very rugged scale material that also holds its tolerances very well. That glass is going to prevent the plastic from creeping over time and from stretching out, even though, especially in knives like this Manix 2 Lightweight, the plastic is really the only strength member in the handle of this knife. There are no steel liners in there. Despite that fact, this knife handle is not going to deform over time and is going to hold its original shape. Now, one fact to note about these knives is that the glass fibers mixed into the plastic are oriented in a random pattern. So there's no directionality to these things. They could be pointing straight up into the camera. They could be pointing right or left. It's really a mixture, and so you get a material that is tough and strong in all directions. That is different from the materials that we're going to introduce next, which are engineered to have strength in the direction that matters most, which is in the bending direction and in the longitudinal direction. And that's because these materials are comprised not of randomly oriented fibers, but of layers of fabric that are stacked one on top of another. Here I have a Three Rivers Atom. This features a micarta handle. Now, micarta is a composite. Again, we have two materials that are combined, and in this case, it is a natural fabric in many, many layers. I don't know if you can see up close, but there are actually, probably 30 or 40 layers of fabric that are laid one on top of another. And then the air is vacuumed out from between those fibers, and a hardening resin, in this case it's a phenolic resin, is introduced into the space that was previously between those fibers, and then they're compressed under very high pressure, and that plastic material, the phenolic resin, is hardened so that what you're left with is a bunch of layers of fabric essentially glued to one another by that plastic material. Now, micarta makes for a very good knife handle. What you end up with is a combination of the properties of the two materials. So we've got a very hard plastic in the phenolic resin that ends up being quite tough. And we've got a very comfortable material in cotton, linen, or paper that feels very natural to the hand when you pick these knives up. You also get a little bit of fraying typically on the edges of these knives, and as they wear over time, they just feel really good in the hand. They have a bit of an insulating characteristic because of that fabric, and so they don't feel cold. They feel very natural. It's a very natural material, and that really comes through as you're using the knife. You're not going to get a ton of stiffness out of this material, and that's because fabrics like cotton or linen have stretch to them, and they will actually stretch as you're pushing on the material. You get a bit of flex. That's typically okay, but it's going to be common in these knives for you to find that the handle itself is not made of micarta alone, but of micarta backed up by a liner of some sort. In this case, we've got titanium liners. Often you'll find micarta actually glued to the handles of a fixed blade knife where it offers that good handhold, but isn't being relied upon for a ton of rigidity. Nonetheless, micarta is an excellent knife handle material. I really like it. But in terms of raw strength and stiffness, it does not compare to our next knife handle material, which is G10. Now, G10 is actually very similar to micarta. Rather than using something like a cotton fabric, what we've got here is a fiberglass fabric. That is tiny threads of glass that are woven together to create a sheet, and then many layers of those fabric are layered together and compressed. This time, the filler is typically an epoxy resin, which is then allowed to harden, forming this kind of a sheet here. Now, fiberglass is many, many times stiffer than something like cotton or linen or paper, and so you will often find knives that use G10 as a standalone structural material, like in this Spyderco Native. This Native has scales made entirely of G10. There are no steel liners or anything like that. It's plenty strong, and that's because glass has very good engineering properties. It's incredibly strong, approaching probably something like aluminum in total strength and in its ability to resist flexing. In engineering, we describe something which is called the Young's modulus, which describes how elastic something is. And glass has a very high Young's modulus, meaning that it does not want to stretch. And if you imagine yourself trying to stretch something made out of glass, you can see what would happen. It will, rather than stretch very much, it will stretch just a very tiny bit before shattering when too much force is applied. That leads to scales that are very stiff because this fabric trapped within the epoxy does not want to stretch on its own. You don't get very much flexure out of this knife handle, even when you're pushing on it very hard. It's going to resist you quite well. Disadvantages of fiberglass are that it can be a bit heavy. Glass is a heavy material. Epoxy is not a very lightweight material, and when you combine them, you get something that is very robust and rugged, but that can be a bit heavy. If we look at this material under the microscope, again, we're going to see a weave of glass fabric. That means that the face of the material is actually going to be composed of glass, which is very hard. That leads to a very scratch-resistant material. It's also extremely water-resistant due to the epoxy binder that's used in the construction of these things. If there's perhaps one downside to this material, it is that it can take pretty severe dings when dropped on something. But during day-to-day use, it's going to be very hard to scuff seriously something that has a G10 handle. Interesting fact before we move on to the next material is that G10 is the material that's used in computer circuit boards, where all of these properties like strength and rigidity, resistance to moisture, and its insulative value are useful to people who design things like computer chips and motherboards for computers. All right, and as we move up the scale of composite materials, we are next onto carbon fiber, kind of the king of composite materials. Rather than using glass, in this case what we've got is a fabric made out of carbon fibers. Here I've got a Spyderco Dragonfly that was just released as a dealer exclusive. Now the benefits of something like carbon fiber over glass fiber are that it is even stiffer. The modulus of carbon fiber, that means its stretchiness essentially, is about 4 times less than that of fiberglass. And it has a breaking strength, total strength, that's something like 30 to 100% better than glass. That means that a knife made out of carbon fiber is going to be both extremely strong and extremely stiff. That's popular for people who like knives because what it gives you is a knife that just feels really good. It's going to transmit those vibrations from the locking mechanism snapping into place extremely well throughout the entire handle material, giving you just a really good tactile feel for what's going on with your knife. That's why this material is used in fishing rods often, carbon fiber, because you get a really good feel for what's going on at the end of your fishing rod. It also doesn't conduct heat as well as glass does, and so you've got a material that, although it is synthetically produced, feels natural, almost like a micarta. If we look at this material under the microscope, we can see that it is made of thousands of tiny threads of carbon that are woven together into a fabric. And I'll see if I can get even closer so we can get a better look at that. And there we can see under higher magnification what each of those fibers looks like in the fiber bundles. I actually have some professional experience in carbon fiber technology. These fibers are made by first creating a plastic fiber of the same size. That's created by squirting it out of a very tiny shower head and stretching it as it cools to create a plastic fiber that has most of its molecules aligned along the length of the fiber. It is then heated in an oxygen-free environment so that basically everything but the carbon sort of burns or evaporates off. In engineering terms, it's called being pyrolyzed. But you heat it very hot until nothing's left but carbon, and that gives you carbon fiber, which has all these amazing properties that give it its incredible strength. That's what also makes carbon fiber extremely expensive. You not only have to create very tiny plastic fibers, you then have to heat them under very controlled conditions so that they are pyrolyzed rather than burned. The fibers are very tiny, so you have to avoid breakage. It requires extremely expensive and sophisticated machines to manufacture. Just a rare and really cool material that represents some of the best technology we have in our hands today. All right, let's talk about our last composite material. Here I've got a Hella Temagami. This is the one designed by Les Stroud, and I have put a wooden handle on this knife. Wood is actually a composite. It is a natural composite that is comprised of two different materials. It is lignin and cellulose that are mixed together to create this, very linear structure, not unlike a fabric that's aligned, kind of in one direction along the grain of the wood. This is desert ironwood here. And if we look at that under the microscope, again, we can see a highly structured material that's oriented in along one axis. Wood is naturally designed to be very good at handling repetitive stress. That's because trees are often faced with wind. They need to be able to hold up to repeated stresses, repeated stretching, and they are very robust for that reason. They make a great knife handle because they have that very natural feel to them. Wood is also very strong, and if the correct wood is picked, can actually be very resistant to rot and moisture. Typically in knife handles, we see types of woods that have lots of resin in them. That includes things like cocobolo, bocote, desert ironwood, or woods that are naturally resistant to rot. That would include things like cypress, maybe Osage orange. All of these materials last a very long time. One of the downsides of wood is that it is not very good at holding tolerance. So wood over time will grow and shrink with the weather. It tends to pick up moisture from the air and swell. And then during the dry season, it will shrink as the moisture decreases. You're not going to see it used very often as a structural material in a knife, but it nonetheless makes for a very good material. It's often used in fixed blades where the structural strength of the knife is provided by the blade itself, and these handle scales are really for looks and for getting yourself a good grip, where it serves its purpose very well. All right, moving on from composite materials, let's talk metal handles. I know a lot of you guys like your metal handles. Before we move on to titanium, which is incredibly popular these days, let's talk about aluminum handled knives. Now, aluminum sometimes is viewed as a cheaper material because it's less expensive for makers to use, but it offers many advantages. First off, aluminum is extremely light, about half the weight, if I remember correctly, of titanium, but still plenty strong for knife handles. This stuff is used all over the place in aircraft. Typically, the skin and skeleton of your aircraft is going to be made of aluminum. That's because it's so light and relatively strong. It also has an advantage over titanium in that it can take a very hard surfacing very inexpensively. This knife here features a hard anodized coating, which is where, using electrolysis, an aluminum oxide layer is created on the surface of the metal. That's just the metal reacting with oxygen, kind of the same as rust with iron, but in this case, it is aluminum reacting with the oxygen to create aluminum oxide. That aluminum oxide coating is also extremely hard. We're talking about this aluminum oxide coating being in the class of materials that falls just under diamond on the hardness scale. It is going to be almost impossible to scratch the surface of this material with anything you're going to come across during daily use. Another advantage of the aluminum oxide coating is that it's porous, and so it can be dyed a whole variety of colors, essentially anything on the rainbow. In this case, they've dyed that coating black. They've simply applied a black dye during the process of giving this knife its coating, and that dye seeps into those crevices in the coating and gives you a very durable and fade-resistant coloration that will last the lifetime of the knife. Unfortunately, these knives can be scratched, or gouged rather, if you run into something that's actually hard enough to deform the layer beneath the coating. You can cut the aluminum beneath and leave yourself a bit of a gouge. But for most purposes, you can consider these knives to be scratch-free. Simply give them a good scrub, and any scuffs on the surface will probably come off and go away completely. And lastly, did you think we would forget, is titanium. Titanium has a lot of advantages over aluminum. First off, it's even more corrosion resistant than aluminum is. It's also extremely strong, twice as strong as aluminum. Titanium is typically on par with the strength of a mild steel, despite its being something like half the weight. Unfortunately, titanium cannot take that extremely hard surface coating like aluminum can. And so rather than a hard anodization, what you often find is a surface finish that is intentionally designed to disguise scratches that will naturally occur as you use the knife. In this case, we've got a stonewashed surface on this quiet carry, which is an intentional scratch pattern that tends to hide those natural scratches and snail trails that you'll pick up as you carry this in your pocket and use it day to day. Other common finishes include bead blasting or sand blasting. Interesting fact about the titanium scales that you have on your knife is that they're probably made out of 6Al4V titanium rather than pure titanium. That means they include about 6% aluminum and 4% vanadium. Those alloying elements help to stabilize the crystal structure within the titanium itself, leading to a mixture of different forms of titanium crystals that gives it additional strength and stability, and also gives it a really good resistance to metal fatigue, meaning that the spring bars on these knives are going to last basically forever. It's almost impossible to wear them out by flexing them over and over again. Titanium makes a very good spring due to its properties. Specifically, the 6Al4V titanium is just really, really good at doing its job in pocket knives. One final advantage that I forgot to mention as we were talking about this knife is that titanium is less thermally conductive than aluminum is. So when you pick up these knives, even if you're in cold weather, although the metal is just as cold as an aluminum knife handle would be, it's not going to feel as cold because it won't be able to transfer that temperature to your hands or take the heat out of your hands nearly as quickly. That gives it a more natural feel that a lot of people just really like, and is part of the reason, I think, for why it's such a popular handle material. I love it. I've got a ton of knives made out of titanium, and there's a reason it's kind of choice number one for high-end knife makers. All right, guys, that's our list of handle materials. I hope you enjoyed the video. This video is definitely on the nerdier end of knife information, but I find this kind of stuff fascinating. I hope you did too. Make sure to hit the subscribe button down below, and we will see you next time. This is Ryan, signing off.